So if you use the installer of Loopstack, you will already have an environment where some demo module is already installed. So if you look into the source directory, here you have the examples module. And under these example modules, there are a couple of examples that show you how basic things are done. It's just a very good place to get started and to understand how Loopstack works. But before I go into the code, let's switch over to the front end to show you what is actually what these examples are actually doing. So here we have our front end of our fresh installation of Loopstack. It's under localhost 3000, and I'm currently at the dashboard. Let's go over here to My Workspaces and create a new workspace, which is the first step you need to do. So the framework comes with this example workspace already installed. So let's use this one and create. Now we have the example workspace. Let's select it. And in this workspace, we can now run our automations. So let's have a look at which ones are available. So here you see the examples. There we will add more examples down the road, but these are the current ones that are available. So you have a simple prompt example, a basic LLM chat, some example about structured output. Tool calling is one another example, and then we have a full example of fully functional but very simple automation, which is a meeting notes optimizer. Let's start with the very first one, simple prompt, and just run it here. And we can now define some arguments which with we want to run this automation. In this case, this simple prompt example is just writing a haiku for us, and we can now define a subject about what it's going to write about. So in this case, the default is coffee. Let's just leave it there and run the automation here. And there it is, very simple automation, really just to show you how to execute a prompt with Loopstack. So let's go into the files and see on the backend side how this one is configured. So for that, we go under source into the example module, and then under LLM, we have the prompt example here. So let's open this, and you see there's only two files, very simple. The first file is the TypeScript file, which is the wrapper, the TypeScript service that we implemented. And here we define a couple of things. First, we say that we need the AI generate text tool, and I'm going to show you how to work with that in a minute. So we import this one so it's available for our automation. And then we define properties. That was the subject we defined for running the initial automation with arguments. And this is just a sort schema we defined up here, where it says that we want to have the subject property as a string, and the default value will be coffee. Then we also reference our prompt workflow YAML file, which is basically the configuration about what the workflow should do, that all that's happening in the YAML file. And then we have one property here in the workflow, which is accessible, which is the LLM response. So we temporarily save the response to this variable, so it's available within the workflow. So let's switch over to the YAML file, because that's really the interesting part. And again, this is a very simple example. Here we can start with giving us a title and a description. These two properties you can see in the Studio front end as well. We also define that how the UI, how the form of that property or that argument that we've seen, how that should be rendered in the UI. So here we have the property subject, and we just give it a title. There are other options we can define here, but for this, input field is totally fine, default input field, and just give it a more meaningful title. Now, the interesting part here now is the transitions. So that's the state machine that this workflow goes through. And every workflow starts with the start transition or with the place start. So the first transition that we define starts with the place start and transitions into the place prompt executed. This is something you can define however you like. It's just an identifier. And within this transition, we want to call and we make it want to do a tool call, and we call this tool execute prompt. Now, again, this is optional. We don't need to add the ID here, but sometimes it's helpful to have like little bit more documentation in here. But we can also remove this if we want. Now we define we want to call this tool AI generate text, which is basically just a tool for making a request to the OpenAI API, which we define here. So we define that we want to use OpenAI as the LLM provider, and we want to use the model GPT-4o to write our small haiku. Then we add the prompt here, and we pass in the subject into the prompt and render this into the prompt. Lastly, we assign the response of that tool, what we call here, we assign this to our LLM response variable. This was the one we defined here under workflow, in our workflow, the property here. Make sure that you decorate this property with the input decorator. So in this way, it allows the workflow to save information back into this variable. Vice versa, if you use expose, then this variable can be accessed from the workflow you define in YAML. And that happens in the next step. So here we have the next transition, and we transition from this prompt executed to the end place. And here we call the tool create document. And this is basically creating this AI message document, which we see in the front end using the content from our LLM response.